Every U.S. president has a final moment, some heroic, some heartbreaking, and a few almost too poetic to believe. But before the bullets, scandals, and conspiracies, America's first leaders left this world in ways that felt written by history itself. It all began with the man who started it all, George Washington. In December 1799, Washington rode through icy rain and snow to check his Virginia estate. When he returned home, he was soaked and freezing, but refused to change clothes. By morning, his throat was swollen and breathing had become difficult. Back then, medicine had one terrifying solution for nearly everything: bloodletting. Doctors drained 80 ounces of Washington's blood, believing it would balance his body. Instead, it drained his life. Barely able to speak, Washington faced his final moments with calm courage. "I die hard," he said, "but I am not afraid to go." Moments later, his final words, "'Tis well." And with that, the first president of the United States took his final breath, strong, stoic, and silent. But history wasn't finished with its strange sense of timing. Because on July 4th, 1826, the nation's 50th birthday, two of Washington's successors, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, also died, within hours of each other. Adams and Jefferson had once been brothers in Revolution, fighting together for independence, but politics divided them. The election of 1800 turned allies into enemies. Years later, though, they rekindled their friendship through letters, long, thoughtful reflections on life, liberty, and legacy. Then came that fateful July morning. In Virginia, Jefferson, weak and fading, asked his doctor, "Is it the 4th?" Told it wasn't yet. He held on until dawn. His final whisper, "No, doctor, nothing more." Hours later in Massachusetts, John Adams, unaware of Jefferson's passing, spoke his last words. "Thomas Jefferson survives. He was wrong, but somehow in spirit perfectly right." The eerie pattern continued. James Monroe, the nation's 5th president, died exactly 5 years later. On July 4th, 1831, suffering from heart failure and tuberculosis, Monroe's final words were filled with quiet longing. "I regret that I should leave this world without again beholding him." He was speaking of his friend James Madison, and that same Madison nearly joined them. In 1836, as his health declined, doctors tried to keep him alive until July 4th to extend the Independence Day legacy, but Madison refused. He smiled softly and said, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear." He passed away peacefully, just 6 days before the 4th. Think about that. The first 50 years of the United States, 3 of its first 5 presidents died on Independence Day. Adams, Jefferson, Monroe, gone on the same date that defined the nation they built. Coincidence? Maybe. But it feels more like history's signature written in perfect, impossible timing. The founders' deaths were almost poetic, quiet, meaningful, and timed with destiny itself. But that peace wouldn't last, because the next presidents, they wouldn't go out with calm last words or gentle goodbyes. Some collapsed mid-sentence. Some died from the simplest mistakes, even from eating fruit. And one man's final thought was about soup. The Founding Fathers left this world like legends, calm, poetic, and perfectly timed with history. But the peace that defined their era didn't last, because the next generation of presidents would face death, not with destiny's poetry, but with sudden shock. Our story begins with John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams and the only president to return to Congress after leaving the White House. Even in old age, his fire never faded. He fought against slavery, stood for education, and debated until the very end. But in 1848, while giving a speech inside the House chamber, his voice suddenly stopped. Witnesses said he staggered, whispered, "This is the end of me," and collapsed onto his desk. For 2 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness in the speaker's room of the Capitol. His final words were gentle but powerful. "This is the last of Earth. I am content." He died surrounded by colleagues, in the very building where he'd fought his last battles for freedom. Next came William Henry Harrison, a hero of war and a man with the shortest presidency in American history. He was sworn in on a cold, wet day in 1841. Refusing a coat or hat, he gave the longest inaugural speech ever recorded, nearly 2 hours long in the freezing wind. Just 3 weeks later, he developed pneumonia. Doctors tried everything: opium, brandy, castor oil, even snakeweed. Nothing worked. After 31 days in office, Harrison became the first president to die while serving. His final words were spoken to his doctor. But historians believe they were meant for his successor, sir. I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more. The next tragedy struck Zachary Taylor, only 9 years later. It was the summer of 1850, brutally hot in Washington. After attending a 4th of July celebration, Taylor cooled off with a bowl of cherries and a glass of iced milk. Within hours, he was violently ill, his stomach burned, his pulse weakened, and doctors once again used the wrong remedies. 5 days later, the 12th President of the United States was gone, likely from severe gastroenteritis or contaminated water. His final words were faint but resolute. I have always done my duty. I'm ready to die. My only regret is to leave my friends. The man who'd survived battle after battle had been defeated by desert. And then there was Millard Fillmore, the quiet, unassuming man who followed Taylor. He spent his final years away from politics, living a peaceful life in Buffalo, New York. In 1874, a sudden stroke left him partially paralyzed. When doctors tried to feed him a spoonful of soup, Fillmore managed a single sentence, dry, ironic, and haunting. The nourishment is palatable. Moments later, he slipped away. From collapsing on the floor of Congress to dying over cherries and soup, these men's deaths were a reminder that even the most powerful can meet the simplest ends. The era of peaceful farewells was over. America was changing, and soon, death would no longer come by illness or accident, but by gunfire. They'd faced disease, exhaustion, and time, but the next presidents would face something new: assassination. A gun hidden in a crowd, a handshake turned fatal, and a train station that became a tomb. By now, America had seen presidents die from sickness, bad luck, and even bad cherries. But the peace that once wrapped the presidency was gone, because the next deaths came not from nature, but from the hands of men. Our story begins with Abraham Lincoln, the man who saved the Union and paid for it with his life. It was April 14, 1865. The Civil War was over. The nation was healing. Lincoln, tired but relieved, decided to spend the evening at Ford's Theater to watch Our American Cousin. He took his seat in the balcony, smiling, unaware that behind him, John Wilkes Booth was waiting. At 10:15 p.m., during a line that always drew laughter, Booth stepped forward and fired. The bullet struck Lincoln behind the ear. He never regained consciousness. For 9 hours, doctors tried everything: brandy, bloodletting, even removing blood clots with their fingers. Nothing helped. At 7:22 the next morning, he was gone. Lincoln's final words weren't he recorded, but the scene before the shot was hauntingly tender. Moments before Booth entered, Lincoln turned to his wife and said softly, "There is no city I should like to see as much as Jerusalem." It was as if deep down he already knew. But fate wasn't done. 16 years later, another beloved leader met the same fate: James A. Garfield. Garfield had survived the Civil War, risen from poverty to the presidency, and dreamed of uniting a divided nation. But on July 2, 1881, while waiting at a Washington train station, a disgruntled man named Charles Guiteau approached from behind and fired 2 bullets. One grazed his arm, the other lodged deep in his back. Doctors couldn't find the bullet. For weeks they probed the wound with unsterilized fingers and metal tools, unknowingly infecting him. Garfield lingered for 80 days, suffering fever, agony, and slow starvation. When he finally passed, one of his doctors said quietly, "He didn't die of the bullet. He died of the doctors." Next came William McKinley, a kind, soft-spoken man who loved the people, and the people loved him back. At a Pan-American exposition in Buffalo, New York, that love turned deadly. McKinley stood greeting citizens. When a man wrapped in a white handkerchief extended his hand, inside the cloth was a revolver, 2 shots. Even as he fell, McKinley's words were pure forgiveness. Let no one hurt him. He lingered for 8 days before infection took his life. His last whisper to his wife, "Goodbye all, goodbye. It is God's way. His will be done." And then came John F. Kennedy, the death that changed modern America forever. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas. A bright day, a smiling crowd, a convertible, and a young president full of life. At 12:30 p.m., as his motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza, 3 shots rang out. One hit the president's back, the next fatal struck his head. Jacqueline Kennedy, covered in blood, refused to leave his side. Doctors at Parkland Hospital worked frantically, but within minutes, the 35th President of the United States was gone. His last words, spoken seconds before the shots, were simple to his wife. "You certainly can, T, say that the people of Dallas Haven T given us a nice welcome for presidents, for assassinations. Each one, a nation shaken, a world watching, and a chapter of history closed in gunfire. But not every bullet found its mark, because after Kennedy, some presidents should have died, but didn't. One man was shot and survived. Another was nearly blown up by a bomb. And one was seconds away from being killed by his own bodyguard. Not every bullet hit its mark. Some presidents were spared by luck, by timing, or by pure miracle. And their survival stories are just as unbelievable as those who didn't make it. Our first survivor, Theodore Roosevelt. October 14, 1912, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Roosevelt, no longer president but running again as a third-party candidate, stepped out of his hotel to address a crowd of thousands. As he waved and smiled, a man emerged from the audience and fired a bullet directly into his chest. The crowd gasped. Roosevelt staggered, but didn't fall. He coughed, checked his mouth. No blood. The bullet hadn't hit his lung. Why? Because in his breast pocket were 50 pages of folded speech notes and a metal glasses case. The bullet had to travel through both before it reached him. Refusing medical help, Roosevelt walked onto the stage and delivered his entire 90-minute speech while bleeding from the chest. His opening line, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot." He finished his speech, calmly walked off stage, and only then agreed to go to the hospital. Doctors decided the bullet was too close to his heart to remove, so Roosevelt carried it inside him for the rest of his life. But he wasn't the only one who faced death and stared it down. Fast forward to February 15, 1933, Miami, Florida. President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt was giving a speech from his open car when 5 shots rang out from the crowd. The assassin missed, but Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak was hit and later died from his wounds. Eyewitnesses say Roosevelt never flinched. He stood tall and ordered his driver to stay calm, even comforting Cermak as the chaos unfolded. Cermak's last words to Roosevelt, "I'm glad it was me instead of you." Then came Harry S. Truman, the man who led America through the end of World War II. In 1950, 2 Puerto Rican nationalists tried to storm the Blair House where Truman was staying during White House renovations. Armed with pistols, they exchanged gunfire with Secret Service agents on the steps. One assassin was killed instantly, the other wounded. Truman, just upstairs, rushed to the window only to be pulled back seconds before a bullet shattered the glass. He later said, "A president has to expect that he may be a target." And finally, Ronald Reagan managed. March 30, 1981, Washington, D.C. Reagan had just finished speaking at the Washington Hilton when a man named John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots toward him. A ricocheted bullet struck Reagan under the arm, piercing his lung and missing his heart by less than an inch. Even as Secret Service agents shoved him into the car, Reagan tried to joke, "I think you forgot to duck." At the hospital, while being wheeled into surgery, he looked up at his doctors and quipped, "Please tell me you're all Republicans." He survived barely and walked out of the hospital 12 days later, smiling, for near deaths. For moments where history could have turned a completely different direction, each man survived, and in doing so, changed how America protected its leaders forever. They survived bullets, bombs, and fate itself. But not every presidential death came from violence. Some were so strange, so ironic, that they sound like dark jokes told by history itself. From eating cherries to catching colds in the rain, and one president who literally laughed himself to death. Every life tells a story, but in the end, it's the last words that stay behind. For some presidents, their final moments were filled with courage. For others, regret, reflection, or even humor. Each goodbye, a window into who they truly were. Let's begin where it all started, George Washington. On his deathbed in 1799, struggling to breathe, he looked to his secretary and said calmly, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." Moments later, after checking the time himself, he whispered his last words. "'Tis well." Dignified, simple, just like the man who defined the presidency itself. John Adams, second president, lived long enough to see the nation's 50th birthday. On July 4th, 1826, as the bells of independence rang across America, he looked to the sky and said, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He didn't know Jefferson had died just hours earlier. Two giants, leaving this world together, as if history wanted them to exit side by side. Thomas Jefferson, his old rival and friend, had whispered just before dawn, "Is it the 4th?" And told it was, he smiled faintly and slipped away.
Oh.
The same day, the same cause, the same destiny. Then came James Monroe, who died 5 years later, also on July 4th. His last words were filled with friendship and longing. "I regret that I should leave this world without again beholding him." He was speaking of James Madison. The 4th of July had become the president's day of departure. But not every ending was poetic. Some were heartbreaking or strangely mundane. William Henry Harrison, who'd been president for only 31 days, whispered to his doctor, "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out." I asked nothing more. Even on his deathbed, he was still giving instructions. Zachary Taylor, dying from illness after eating cherries and milk, said quietly, "I have always done my duty. I am ready to die. My only regret is to leave my friends." Millard Fillmore, ever the gentleman, tasted soup, smiled faintly and said, "The nourishment is palatable." Those were his last words, polite to the very end. Abraham Lincoln, struck by an assassin's bullet, never spoke again, but his final recorded words before the shot were to his wife. "In a moment of peace, there is no city I should like to see as much as Jerusalem." James Garfield, dying slowly from infection, whispered, "This pain, this terrible pain." And yet, moments before he slipped away, he asked to see the ocean, longing for one last glimpse of peace. William McKinley's final words were soft, spiritual. "It is God's way. His will be done." Franklin Roosevelt, after years of leadership through the Great Depression and war, looked up from his chair and said, "I have a terrific headache." Moments later, he collapsed from a cerebral hemorrhage. John F. Kennedy's last words, spoken seconds before the gunfire in Dallas, were to his wife, "Certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given us a nice welcome." A light-hearted comment seconds before the world changed forever. And Ronald Reagan, decades later, would survive his own assassination attempt. When he finally passed in 2004, after years of silence from Alzheimer's, his daughter said he left the world at peace, with a smile. Sometimes, the words don't need to be spoken. The legacy speaks for them. Every president, every leader, eventually faces the same truth. Power fades, time runs out. But what remains are the echoes of their last words. Some brave, some ordinary, all human. From Washington's calm to Kennedy's tragedy, their voices fade. But their words remain. Each final sentence isn't just about death, it's about how they lived. A reminder that no matter how high you rise, in the end, every man faces the same silence. And maybe that's the real story of America's presidents, not just how they led, but how they said goodbye.